Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Dwayne R. Stallworth here with Dr. Lewis Baldwin, the foremost MLK scholar in this nation, and we are here to have a conversation regarding the social movement and the black church. But before we get to that point, Dr. Baldwin, such a delight to have you here to address our class on the subject matter of the black church and modern culture. But before we get into the dialogue today, tell us a little bit about yourself and what prompted you to get involved in scholarship regarding MLK.
Well, I'm from Camden, Alabama. I was born in Wilcox County, Camden, Alabama, in 1949. I grew up in Camden, was educated in the segregated school system there in Wilcox County. Graduated from high school in 1967. Matriculated at Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama from 67 to 71, receiving a BA in history. And from that point, of course, I attended Crowther Theological Seminary in New York and completed requirements for a PhD at Northwestern in 1980. And I would say that my exposure in my early years to the civil rights movement and participation in some of the demonstrations in and around Camden and Talladega, Alabama, sort of inspired me to get involved in the movement. And I felt at that time that the best way to get involved in terms of the movement and also in terms of advancing the civil rights cause was to get an education and become an educator. And when the civil rights movement turned the corner with the death of Dr. King in 1968, I began to think very seriously about how I might contribute to the future of the movement. And of course I felt at that time that I could do that by getting a PhD and teaching, doing research and scholarship on Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And that explains how I reached this point. In terms of my teaching. I'm retired now, but I taught for some 35 years. And
let us know your place of employment, your institution.
Yes, I taught at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. Early in my career, I taught at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York, Worcester College in Worcester, Ohio, and in 1984, I actually came to Vanderbilt as an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies. And that was 1984, the fall of '84. And in 1990, I was promoted to the associate professorship level with tenure at Vanderbilt. And in 1998, I became a full professor in the Department of Religious Studies. And in December 2013, after 30 years, almost 30 years of teaching at Vanderbilt, I retired.
Well, we want to say thank you for your many years of contributing to young minds regarding this subject matter of MLK and the church as a whole, but in particular the black church. Which brings us to our current conversation, a social movement and King. Social movement and the black church. You have a book dealing with the legacy of Dr. King. And in this particular book, I do recall you make mention of Booker T. Washington being a phenomenal leader in his time, in his era. If I'm correct, Booker T. Washington died in 1915.
That's right.
King was born in 1929.
That's right.
It's not a huge gap, but it is indeed a gap. But you go on to say that King was the first black strong leader since Washington. Tell us a little bit about that statement.
Yes, I mean, in terms of their appeal to the public imagination. You look at Washington in that period from 1895, when he gave the Atlanta Exposition speech up to his death in 1915. He appealed to black America. He was known throughout black America Many whites in the South and throughout the nation respected him for his leadership in starting Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. So Washington had national stature and international stature, and he was the first leader in the South to have that kind of stature.
Okay.
Then came Dr. King in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. King, in my view, was the second black leader in the South to achieve the kind of national and international stature that Booker Washington had. Of course, with King, it was even more the case because King came along in the era when there was radio and TV, and that had a lot to do with catapulting him to a national and international stature. But both men, I think, when you look at the 20th century, they were the two most prominent African American leaders in the South.
Okay. Excellent, excellent. You have another great book that I love dearly, The Voice of Conscience.
Yeah.
And in this work, you describe how King came to develop his philosophical and theological understanding of the Church Universal.
Yes, that's right.
How did you come to fill that particular gap?
Well, I noticed in my research that no book-length manuscript had been published on King's ideas concerning the church, or his conception of the church, or his thinking about the church. There were a couple of dissertations I found in the late 1990s, but no book had been published, and I found that interesting because we have to understand King first and foremost in terms of his churchmanship. He was a man of the church. He was born and raised in the church. He became a preacher at age 18, ordained in the church. His whole life was connected in some way with the Christian church, and especially Southern Black Baptist Protestantism. So I decided in 2008, 2009 that I should write a book and publish a book on King's attitude toward the church, his involvements with the church. So in 2010, Oxford University Press issued my book, The Voice of Conscience, The Church in the Mind of Martin Luther King Jr. And as you said, that book looks not only at King's cultural roots and his upbringing in the church, it also takes into account his theological vision for the church, his understanding of the church, his idea of various images of the church, church as the people of God, the body of Christ, the covenant community. So that book was designed to sort of tease out many of the ecclesial images, images of the church that figured prominently in Dr. King's thinking.
So while we're talking about this particular development, I think this is why your work is so important, because it gives us a view of those nuances regarding the life and structure of Dr. King. A lot of people know that King was the son of a Baptist preacher, the grandson of a Baptist preacher,
and the
great-grandson of a Baptist preacher. Talk a little bit about how that heritage, that pedigree formed his social development.
Yes, I think that's very, very important. You talk about King as being a part of an unbroken tradition in Southern Black Baptist Protestantism. Of course, some of his uncles were preachers. His brother was a preacher. So, you know, he was sort of steeped in that culture. And he often said, Dr. King did, that there was no other job or occupation or vocation I could take on. Because I'm the son, grandson, great-grandson, nephew of preachers. So it's in my blood in a sense. So he had initially thought in terms of becoming a lawyer or a medical doctor. and perhaps even a professor in a college
mhm,
or university or seminary.
mhm,
But because of that influence of that long tradition, the
mm,
black church tradition,
mhm,
he decided ultimately to become a minister,
mm,
and along with that to do some teaching on the side. But a
yeah.
minister and a theologian because of his deep roots in the black church.
Okay. Excellent. Um, normally when you hear about preachers taking on the calling of ministry, it's often defined as this esoteric phenomenon, this spiritual enlightenment that happens through osmosis and pow. God has put a lightning bolt through your spiritual being, and you were awakened to go forth and carry on the message.
Sort of like Paul on the Damascus Road.
Absolutely, absolutely. But that wasn't the case with King, was it?
Yeah. Dr. King said at the American Baptist Convention in 1959, statement he gave on his call to preach, that he had an inner urge.
Mm.
It was nothing like a lightning bolt, him having the same kind of experience that Paul had, but it was an deep inner urge to serve God and humanity. He said that was his call. Okay, and so he was moved, he was inspired, he was motivated by that kind of inner urge to go out and serve God and humanity. And you'll notice that when many black preachers in that era talked about their call, they focused only, in many cases, on serving God. There was always that spiritual angle that had to do with responding to the call of God and serving God, but very few really emphasized the need to serve humanity. And I think if you're going to understand how Dr. King turned out in terms of his civil rights leadership and his role as a social activist, you got to look more seriously at his call and how he described that call when he stood before the American Baptist Convention in 1959.
Do you think that particular stance from King provided him with more authenticity in terms of not sugarcoating the ministry, but seeing social ills and evils for what they really were, diametrically opposed to the will of God?
That's right. Not limiting his understanding of ministry. Dr. King said in his book Stride Toward Freedom, the very first book he wrote and published in 1958, that when he went to Montgomery, that he met many ministers who had a very limited view of what the call was about. And they talked in terms of saving souls and focusing on issues of personal piety and that kind of thing. But Dr. King said, hey, that was too narrow for him. It was always too narrow, because he understood ministry as a holistic ministry. That is, that ministry should deal not only with the spiritual, but with the social, the political, the economic, the educational, you name it. Ministry should be holistic. And same with the church. Dr. King, like Carter G. Woodson, thought in terms of the church as comprehensive community. The church is all comprehending institution. That institution that serves not only the spiritual needs of black people, that institution whose function extends beyond the spiritual and the ecclesiastical to cover all departments of life, even the recreation, the social, the economic, the political. So King understood ministry and the church, I think, in more holistic terms. And he thought that many ministers were too confined or too limited in their understanding of what the church and its ministry should be about.
Okay. Briefly about the intellectual development of King. Particularly within this generation, there's a snapshot view of Dr. King. I Have a Dream speech, and his PhD from Boston, and that's the snapshot that they get. But as we talked about earlier, King began to develop this intellectual prowess at a very young age.
At a very young age, man. He actually entered college at Morehouse at age I think, age 15 in 1944. Yes, he was 15 years old. Finished college at age 19. But when I look at Dr. King's intellectual pilgrimage, I don't begin with the pilgrimage to nonviolence, which he published first in 1958. I begin with the autobiography of religious development, which he completed as a paper at Crowther Theological Seminary in 1950. Now, in that autobiography of religious development, he actually describes the beginning, I think, of that intellectual pilgrimage that ultimately led him to what? Pursue education, receive a PhD, and to get involved in a social movement. You have to read that autobiography of religious development first, published, issued, completed in 1950, and then you read his pilgrimage to nonviolence, which was first published in 1958, and you get a sense of not only the importance of Morehouse College and Crowther Theological Seminary and Boston University on Dr. King's intellectual development, but you also get a sense of the importance of the black church, the black family structure, the extended family structure, and also that church tradition and the larger black neighborhood of Atlanta, how all of these elements came together to educate Dr. King and to also prepare him for the kind of high education that he would get at Crowther and Boston University. King went to Crowther and Boston with an openness to liberal ideals, and that came not from Crowther and Boston, but from Morehouse and his surroundings there in Atlanta, church, family, etc.
You know, and I love what you do in your research. You articulate that King developed the social gospel, and we'll talk a little bit. I'll let you expand on that thought. But he developed his social gospel philosophy at a very young age. It didn't happen at Morehouse. It didn't happen at Crowther. It didn't happen at Boston, but it happened.
We have to keep in mind now that King's maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, pastored Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta from 1894, I think it was, to 1931. He was a social gospel preacher. King's mother's father, a social gospel preacher. And when Martin Luther King Sr. took over Ebenezer upon the death of his father-in-law in 1931, he brought that same social gospel approach to Ebenezer's ministry that his father-in-law had embraced and promoted. And so King came up in a church culture in which there was this sense that the gospel is not only about personal salvation, it's about social salvation. It's about saving people from economic doom. It's about empowering people educationally, socially, culturally, economically, politically. So he got that from the church. He had no other choice but to grow up with this strong sense of the gospel as a social gospel. And of course, that's why he became the foremost civil rights leader of the 20th century.
Indeed, King does describe in many writings that the church, the black church, in particular, was indeed his second home.
Exactly.
So talk to us about how he became influenced intellectually from mentors. We talked about how he was influenced from the familial context. So what academics?
Well, I began with Benjamin Mays, and George Kelsey at Morehouse College. There were other professors there, Gladstone Chandler, Samuel Williams in philosophy. I think you have to begin there with Dr. King's intellectual journey. A lot of scholars begin with George Davis at Crowther, Kenneth L. Smith at Crowther, and then when they moved to Boston and look at L. Harold Wolff and Edgar S. Brightman. But I began with Samuel Williams and Gladstone Chandler and and Benjamin E. Mays and George Kelsey at Morehouse, these African American churchmen, intellectuals, great thinkers, theologians, King, the groundwork, the foundation for King's development as a theologian, as a social gospel thinker, actually started at Morehouse College. Then we go to Crows and look at George Davis, who taught King personalism, liberal theology and ethics at Crozer. Then Kenneth L. Smith, who taught King about Niebuhr and some of the Reinhold Niebuhr, some of the other thinkers. Then you go to Boston University, where he pursued the PhD and studied with L. Howard Wolf and Edgar S. Brightman. So there's a trajectory at work here that begins with Morehouse College, after, of course, the Ebenezer Church and his strong black family tradition, which emphasized education. You begin there, and then you move to Crozer, where Dr. King did not get his ideals, but he found at Crozer in Boston what? The intellectual categories, a kind of conceptual framework to articulate ideals that he brought from Morehouse College, that he brought from his family and church background.
Very fascinating. You mentioned personalism. You know, this is a key component.
Yes.
To the intellectual journey, development of King in terms of how he structured his outlook for social justice.
Yes. Now you
what is his personalism?
You talk about personalism. It's the idea that the clue to ultimate reality is found in personality. And the argument on the part of the personalists, personalism started at Boston University with a scholar by the name of Boyden P. Bound in 1876. And it argued that the clue to understanding ultimate reality is found in personality, and personality is understood essentially on two levels. God is super personality, or supra, S-U-P-R-A personality. Humans are finite personalities. And personalism developed two ideals that King found very important and embraced. One, of course, is the personal God of love and reason. The argument that God is personal, God is a rational God, God is a loving God. And secondly, the dignity and worth of all human personality. That every human soul has dignity and worth. Rufus Burr and some of the other scholars have argued that certainly King is introduced at Boston and even Crozer to personalism as an intellectual discipline, an intellectual approach to theology and philosophy. They speak of a homespun personalism that King got at Ebenezer Church, Morehouse College, and with the King family. That is, King's family, Morehouse, they all argued for the personal God. King didn't have to go to Crozer in Boston to learn about the personal God. He knew about the personal God before he got there. He knew about this whole issue of the dignity and worth of human personality. But what he found at Crozer in Boston were the intellectual categories, the conceptual framework to articulate these ideals about the personal God and the dignity and worth of all human personality.
So it's almost safe to speculate King needed these intellectual grapplings.
Yes. King came up in a family, as I said earlier, that stressed education as one of its values. There was a value system in the King family. Education was at the top, along with spirituality and what religious values. Okay, so he was encouraged. Daddy King had a BA from Morehouse College. Mama King from Spelman. She was trained in education and music. So he grew up in a family in which education was held in high esteem. There was a great priority put on getting an education. So that's where you have to begin in understanding why Dr. King became not only a theologian, an intellectual, but an intellectual activist type, I like to say, one who translated ideals that he got in the academy, in the educational institutions, into practical reality in the context of civil rights demonstrations and the civil rights movement.
And it's almost as if King was searching for theoretical paradigms to validate the internal unctions that he had from God.
Yes. I think that's true. Dr. King understood that he lived and functioned in a culture where ideals were very, very important. That if he was an activist with an educational background, that carried even more weight. A lot of activists just go out and struggle, but Dr. King was educated first, and he was able to apply ideals in the struggle. He was able to translate certain ideals that he got in the educational institutions into practical action and practical reality out in the streets. And I think that's what's so powerful about Dr. King. He brought so much to the movement, not only in terms of ideals and a philosophy, but also strategy, tactics, a model for social activism.
Excellent. So we're talking about, again, this intellectual journey of Dr. King. What a lot of people may not understand is that there was some separation from Daddy King.
Oh yeah.
In terms of intellectual fronts and agreement.
Yes. There's no surprise that Dr. King differed from his father theologically. At the same time, we have to begin with the fact that King says in his autobiography of Religious Development that many of the ethical principles that his father embraced, he embraced also and held on to. But Dr. King was trained in liberal theology. He got a PhD. Daddy King had a BA and remained essentially a fundamentalist, a biblical fundamentalist. So King would question the virgin birth, literally. He would question biblical inerrancy. King often spoke in terms of the authority of the Bible. He didn't use terms like biblical literalism or biblical inerrancy. Daddy King did. Daddy King believed in the inerrancy of Scripture. He believed in biblical literalism. In fact, when young Martin King Jr. was ordained at age 18 in February of 1948, one of the questions that came up during the committee examination, his daddy and Lucius Tobin and Benjamin Mays, others were on his ordination committee, and they asked him about virgin birth, and he denied it. It was something mythological to him, part of the mythology that the early church put out in order to heighten their sense of the divinity of Jesus. And he made that point. Now, ordinarily, he would not have been ordained by many Southern black preachers, but this was Daddy King's son, and there were liberal theologians on his committee, so he was able to pass the test. But he and Daddy King got in some heated arguments at times over theology. King was not so much into doctrine as many fundamentalists are. Their approach to the faith largely doctrinal. It's about missionary Christianity, going ye into all the world and preaching the gospel and saving souls. King didn't see doctrine or this missionary approach as central to the faith. He said that love is central to the Christian faith. So he didn't go out preaching doctrine a lot, and didn't go out stressing this missionary Christianity in the Western sense. But he did say that I embrace, I promote applied Christianity, practical Christianity, rooted in the love ethic. I go out and I show love. I fight for justice through love. Okay? So he not doctrinal Christianity, not missionary Christianity. because that's what fundamentalists are hung upon. But for Dr. King, it's practical, applied Christianity. And he talked a lot about love, as you well know, and translating the Christian love ethic into nonviolent action. Okay, through boycotts and acts of civil disobedience, and prayer vigils and boycotts, that kind of thing.
What I love, well, many aspects of your teaching, but one thing that really sticks out is how you categorize that particular element for your students. Being a former student, that is a visual that I will never forget, because you added meat to the conversation. But tell us how you define the far left, the right, and the middle.
Yes, I talked about a lot of that in my King course, because I was trying to locate King on the theological spectrum, and also in terms of where he stood biblically. And I often did that by saying that you have to look first at the liberal side, which is on the extreme left. Theological liberals have always been on the left. In the center, of course, evangelicals like Billy Graham, and on the right, extreme right, fundamentalists. Now, you draw the distinction this way. Liberals are very open to scholarship. They're very open to modernistic trends in the culture and what modernism has to teach us. Evangelicals, somewhat open. For an example, Billy Graham, he accepted certain streams of biblical criticism. Evangelicals would do that. Evangelicals will associate with liberals. Billy Graham preached to actors and actresses out in Hollywood. He was an evangelical, okay, in the center. But on the extreme right, you got people like Bob Jones, many black church leaders, who are rigid biblical fundamentalists, who do not associate with liberals, and who use terms like biblical inerrancy and biblical literalism. That is, the Bible is correct and inerrant down to the last letter. You see, Dr. King was not a fundamentalist. He did embrace certain elements of Christian evangelicalism. Particularly, evangelicalism emphasized the importance of the gospel. But King understood that gospel in liberal theological terms. When he talked about the gospel speaking to the whole person, not just to the need for the personal salvation, but the need for what? Saving people from economic and political and social doom. Okay? So that's how I draw that distinction. King was on the left of the theological spectrum. He was on the left of the biblical spectrum. And of course that's what distinguished him and made it possible for him to really take that gospel of Jesus Christ and to make it relevant to the conditions, the social, political, and economic conditions that people experienced in the 1950s and 60s.
Excellent, excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here with the great MLK scholar, Dr. Lewis Baldwin, discussing social movements, the black church, and King. When we come back, we will get into how King developed and defined his particular social movement.